Over the past year, we've seen a huge shift in immigration enforcement here in the U.S., really driven by a wave of new policies and a massive surge in funding. So in this explainer, we're going to connect the dots from the policy decisions in Washington, D.C., all the way to the human stories unfolding inside the nation's detention centers. Let's get into it. You feel like your life is over. That's how one man from Colombia described his time inside a Florida immigration detention center. And that quote, right there, it gets to the very heart of what's at stake. To really understand how we got to this point, we have to follow the money. So the first piece of this puzzle is the funding. A major expansion of enforcement like the one we're seeing, well, it just can't happen without a massive financial commitment from the federal government. And when you look at the numbers, you really see what we're talking about. For fiscal year 2025, this enacted budget was just over $10 billion. But the request for 2026, it jumps to nearly $10.9 billion. That's an 8.4% increase. We're talking about an extra $838 million. This new funding is specifically designed to fuel a much, much broader enforcement mandate. And it's not just about the money. It's being paired with new legislation. The Lake and Raley Act, which passed in January 2025, actually requires ICE to detain any non-citizen charged with a whole range of crimes. And we're not just talking about serious felonies here. The list includes offenses like theft and shoplifting. The key thing to understand is that the law now mandates detention for a much wider group of people than before. So what happens when you combine billions in new funding with a much broader mandate to detain people? What does that actually look like for folks on the ground in their communities? And that brings us right to our second section, what this new approach actually looks like out in communities across the country. Okay, first we need to understand a really key concept, protected areas. For years, federal policy restricted immigration enforcement in what were considered sensitive locations. Places like schools, hospitals, and churches or mosques. The whole idea was to make sure that everyone, regardless of their status, could access essential services without fear. But in January of 2025, that policy was rescinded. That barrier, the one that limited enforcement in these community hubs, was removed. It essentially opened the door for operations in places that were once considered off-limits. At the same time, we're seeing this massive expansion of partnerships between federal and local police. Through what are called 287G agreements, ICE basically deputizes local officers to act as federal immigration agents. And the scale of this is just staggering. In Florida, 76% of law enforcement agencies have signed on. To give you some perspective, the next highest state, Wyoming, has just 11%. And, this increased enforcement can have tragic consequences. In January 2026, during what DHS called its largest operation ever in Minnesota, ICE agents shot and killed 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good in her car. That incident immediately raised some very serious questions about the use of force and the real-world impact of these large-scale operations. So with more arrests happening in more places, it's no surprise that the population inside immigration detention centers has swelled. So now let's take a look at what reports from inside these facilities are telling us. This is Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas. It is the nation's largest immigration detention facility, a $1.2 billion complex of massive tents built to hold 3,000 people. And there's this really stark piece of history here. It was built on the very same site as a former Japanese internment camp from World War II. And the reports from inside this facility are, well, they're deeply disturbing. An ACLU investigation documented dozens of accounts of abuse. This quote here is from Samuel, which is a pseudonym for a teenager who described being beaten so badly he ended up in the hospital. His story is just one of many, alleging extreme physical and sexual abuse by officers. And the issues seem to be systemic. Detainees are reporting chronic food shortages, with meals that are often spoiled or even still frozen. They say basic things like soap are scarce. People have described tents and bathrooms flooding with foul water, creating these squalid and unsafe conditions just months after this brand new facility opened. Now, if we go thousands of miles away to Florida, a really similar pattern is emerging. You have detention centers there that are just overwhelmed by a dramatic influx of new detainees. This is from Harpinder Chauhan, a 56-year-old Buddhist entrepreneur, and he's describing his intake at a processing center. Detainees have a name for these cells, La Hielera, which means the icebox, because they're kept frigidly cold. He and so many others report being held for days in overcrowded cells with no beds,
forced to sleep on concrete floors under fluorescent lights that never turn off.
And then there's the medical care. A Human Rights Watch report documented a pattern of what it calls dangerously substandard care. Things like critical medications, insulin for example, were reportedly taken away and never returned. In one case, a man with a strangulated hernia was initially denied hospital care. And after Mr. Chawan himself collapsed and was hospitalized, staff allegedly refused to even tell his frantic son where he was.
So, after hearing all of this, it's really crucial to understand the legal framework here. What are these agencies actually allowed to do by law, and what are their limits?
Okay, first a quick clarification, because it can be confusing. There are two main agencies involved here. On the left, you've got ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They're the ones responsible for enforcement inside the country, including all the detentions we've been talking about. On the right is CBP, Customs and Border Protection. Their job is focused on securing the border itself.
So, federal law gives these agencies some really broad powers. For example, officers can arrest someone without a warrant if they believe that person is in the country unlawfully and might try to flee. They can conduct searches at the border without a warrant or any suspicion at all. And within 100 miles of any U.S. border, they can board vehicles just to search for people.
But, and this is a really big but, these powers are not absolute. The Fourth Amendment of the Constitution protects everybody against unreasonable searches and excessive force. And this creates a fundamental tension between an agency's authority and an individual's constitutional rights. And these limits are actively being fought for and enforced in the courts. For instance, there's something called the Castanyan-Nava Consent Decree. It's a court order that was just extended into 2026, and it explicitly prohibits ICE from making arrests without a warrant or probable cause. It's a direct legal check on the agency's power. And this really brings us to the central question in all of this. As new laws and new funding dramatically expand the power of immigration enforcement, who provides the oversight? When you have all these reports of abuse and inhumane conditions emerging from a detention system that's growing this fast, it raises these fundamental questions about transparency, accountability, and ultimately the balance of power.